The Galactic Coalition's most ironclad law wasn't about the use of antimatter weaponry, nor was it about the preservation of endangered biospheres. It was a single universally mandated directive: do not engage with the species known as humanity. To the elite cadets of the Coalition's premier military academy, this ban was a hilarious joke. How could a primitive, hyper-emotional race from a Class 9 death world be a threat to the most advanced armadas in the cosmos? They laughed. They mocked the ancient treaty. Then the lights dimmed, the sealed archives were opened, and they saw the unedited combat footage. Nobody was laughing anymore. The lecture hall at the Solaria Institute of Advanced Interplanetary Strategy was a marvel of modern galactic architecture. Suspended high above the crystalline spires of the capital world, the room offered a breathtaking panoramic view of a binary sunrise. But the 100 or so cadets gathered inside were not interested in the view. They were the absolute apex of their respective species, the brightest tactical minds, the most genetically optimized warriors, and the future admirals of the Galactic Coalition's combined fleets. They were also at this precise moment incredibly bored. Declan leaned back in his anti-gravity chair, spinning a stylus between his elongated, perfectly manicured digits. He was a scion of the high aristocracy, a lineage that had commanded star cruisers since before the invention of the hyperdrive. Next to him sat Preston, a slightly more pragmatic but equally arrogant cadet who spent most of his time analyzing fleet formations and calculating plasma yield ratios. On the holographic syllabus hovering over their desks, the topic for the day was glowing in stark crimson letters: the Terran Exclusion Act, Article 88. "It's absolute historical fiction," Declan whispered loudly, making no effort to conceal his contempt. He swiped his hand through the hologram, disrupting the red letters into a cloud of digital static before they reformed. "I refuse to believe that the High Council actually drafted a unilateral non-engagement treaty for a species that hasn't even mastered localized gravity manipulation." Preston chuckled, keeping one eye on the heavy oak doors at the front of the hall. "I read the brief last night. Apparently their homeworld Earth still has active tectonic plates and uncontained viral outbreaks. The humans barely survived their own atomic age. They still use kinetic projectile weapons, throwing pieces of metal at each other. It's archaic. Archaic. It's pathetic." Declan scoffed, crossing his arms. He raised his voice, drawing the attention of the cadets in the surrounding tiers. "Think about it. We have the Aegis-class dreadnoughts. We can turn a moon to glass from 3 systems away using focused tachyon beams, and we are told that engaging a Terran vessel is an automatic court-martial. It's a political stunt. The Coalition is just trying to look benevolent by protecting a lesser species." A murmur of agreement rippled through the upper seating tiers. The cadets had spent the last 3 years studying the conquests of the Coalition. They had analyzed the fall of the Kryn Empire, the pacification of the Outer Rim, and the strategic dismantling of the Vandalic Swarm. In every instance, superior technology and cold, calculated logic had won the day. The idea that a single, solitary species from a backwater sector required an absolute quarantine seemed not only absurd, but insulting to their military pride. I heard a rumor piped up a cadet named Oliver from the row behind them. I heard that a human exploratory vessel accidentally breached the neutral zone near the Orion Spur 5 years ago. The local patrol fleet was ordered to stand down and let them pass. Just let them map our defenses and leave. It's cowardice. "It's exactly what it is," Declan agreed, his voice echoing slightly in the vast vaulted room. "If I were in command of that patrol, I would have disabled their primitive engines with an EMP burst, boarded their ship, and shown them what real galactic authority looks like. What are they going to do? Bleed on our power armor? Their biology is notoriously fragile. They require constant hydration, specific oxygen mixtures, and a ridiculous amount of sleep. Not to mention their emotional volatility," Preston added, scrolling through a datapad. "Their psychological profiles are a mess. They operate on instinct and tribal loyalty rather than empirical logic. In a prolonged tactical engagement, they would crumble the moment their command structure was compromised." Declan stood up, playing to his impromptu audience. Exactly, the human ban is nothing but a bureaucratic joke. It's a remnant of some overly cautious diplomatic era. I say the moment we graduate, we petition the Admiralty to repeal Article 88. Let's integrate Earth into the coalition by force, if necessary. We could pacify their entire planetary defense grid in under an hour. A few cadets actually clapped. Declan smiled, soaking in the validation. He was young, brilliant, and entirely untested in the brutal reality of total war. He believed the universe was an equation, and the coalition held all the right variables. The heavy oak doors at the front of the hall slammed open with a sound like a thunderclap. The ensuing silence was instantaneous and absolute. Striding into the room was Professor Harrison. Unlike the pristine, immaculate cadets, Harrison looked like a piece of machinery that had been left out in an acid rainstorm. He walked with a pronounced limp, the result of a cybernetic leg that had clearly been repaired in the field rather than a sterile medical bay. His face was a map of scar tissue, and his eyes, cold slate grey and utterly devoid of amusement, swept over the lecture hall like a targeting laser. Harrison was a legend. He was one of the few surviving commanders of the First Contact War, a conflict so heavily classified that most cadets only knew it through heavily redacted historical texts. He didn't walk to the podium. He stopped dead in the center of the room, looking directly up at Declan, who was still standing. A political stunt, Cadet Declan. Harrison's voice was barely more than a gravelly whisper, yet it carried to every corner of the silent hall. Is that your expert tactical assessment? Declan swallowed hard, but his aristocratic pride prevented him from sitting down. Sir, with all due respect, yes. The metrics don't support the existence of the ban. Humanity's technological inferiority is a documented fact. The embargo is an unnecessary restraint on our fleet's operational jurisdiction. Harrison stared at him for a long, terrible moment. Then he let out a low, dry laugh that sounded like rocks grinding together. Sit down, cadet, Harrison commanded softly. Declan slowly lowered himself into his chair. Harrison limped heavily toward the main control console at the front of the room. You think you understand war because you've run simulations in a climate-controlled room. You think because you know the thermal output of a plasma battery, you know what it means to face an enemy. He tapped a sequence of commands into the console. The heavy blast shutters on the wide windows began to slide shut, blocking out the light of the binary suns and plunging the lecture hall into darkness. Today, Harrison announced the glowing light of the console, illuminating his scarred features. We are skipping the theoretical analysis of Article 88. Today you don't get theory, you get reality. The atmosphere in the lecture hall shifted from bored arrogance to a suffocating tension. The hum of the anti-gravity chairs seemed unnaturally loud in the darkness. Cadet Preston glanced nervously at Declan, but Declan kept his eyes glued to the front, his jaw set in stubborn defiance. Professor Harrison stood bathed in the pale blue light of the central holographic projector. He didn't look angry. He looked exhausted, carrying a weight that none of the young minds in the room could comprehend. You read the briefing packets, Harrison began, his voice echoing in the gloom. You see words like kinetic weapons, fragile biology, and emotional volatility. You process these terms through the lens of our military doctrine. In our doctrine, a kinetic weapon is primitive because it relies on physical mass rather than directed energy. In our doctrine, emotional volatility is a weakness because it leads to illogical tactical decisions. Harrison paced slowly around the projector. But you fail to understand the fundamental difference between us and them. We evolved on garden worlds. We engineered our environments to suit us. We conquered the stars because our worlds gave us the time, the peace, and the resources to look up. He stopped and pointed a scarred finger toward the ceiling. Humanity evolved on a planet that actively tried to kill them every single day. Earth is a crucible of natural disasters, apex predators, microscopic pathogens, and wildly fluctuating climates. They didn't adapt their environment to suit them. They adapted themselves to survive an environment that wanted them dead. That is where their biology comes from, and that is where their psychology comes from. Declan couldn't help himself. He raised his hand, his voice laced with forced bravado. Professor, survival instincts are common among lower-tier species. It doesn't make them a military threat to a Tier 1 coalition battle group. Harrison's eyes locked onto Declan. Survival instinct is fleeing from a predator, cadet. What humans have is something entirely different. They have a biological mechanism called the endocrine system. Under extreme stress, their bodies flood with chemical compounds, epinephrine, norepinephrine, cortisol. Have you studied these? Silence hung in the room. Preston quickly tapped on his datapad. Sir, they are neurochemical stimulants. They temporarily increase heart rate and muscle output. Temporarily, Harrison repeated with a grim nod. In a human, a massive dump of these chemicals effectively overrides their nervous system's safety protocols. In a moment of crisis, a human can lift structural debris that should shatter their skeletal frame. They can sprint on shattered femurs. They can take a grazing hit from a plasma bolt, suffer third-degree burns across half their torso, and keep shooting. A few scoffs echoed in the dark. It sounded too much like pulp fiction. Furthermore, Harrison continued, ignoring the skepticism. You mistake their emotional volatility for weakness. You think an illogical decision is a bad decision, but what happens when an enemy's actions are so divorced from logic that your predictive algorithms cannot anticipate them? Harrison leaned over the console. You think of war as a game of chess. You capture pieces, you control territory, you force a checkmate, and the enemy surrenders because the mathematical probability of their victory has dropped to zero. Humans do not play chess in a war. If you back a human into a corner and reduce their probability of victory to zero, they do not surrender. Harrison's voice dropped an octave, dripping with cold memory. They flip the board, they set the room on fire, and they make sure that if they are going to die, you are coming with them. The professor brought up a series of file directories on the main screen. They were stamped with the highest level of Coalition security clearance, Black Omega. 17 years ago, Harrison said, his hands moving deftly across the holographic keys. Before the treaty was signed, before Article 88 was drafted, the Coalition attempted a pacification action on a remote Terran mining colony. Designation LV-426, locally known by the humans as New Copenhagen. It was supposed to be a standard compliance operation. 2 orbital cruisers, 4 battalions of elite shock troops. The humans had a single, underfunded security detail armed with exactly the primitive kinetic weapons you mock. Declan crossed his arms. And I assume the shock troops established a perimeter and took the colony within the solar cycle. The operation, Harrison said softly, lasted for 6 weeks. We lost 3 entire battalions. The survivors mutinied and demanded extraction. The Admiralty covered it up. They classified the footage, sealed the records, and drafted the Terran Exclusion Act the very next year. Preston's eyes went wide. 3 battalions, that was over 4,000 heavily armed, shielded, and genetically enhanced soldiers, defeated by a mining colony. You think the ban is to protect them from us, Harrison said, pressing the final execution key on the console. You are arrogant, you are naive, and you are wrong. The ban is there to protect us from them. The central holographic projector hummed to life. The pale blue light vanished, replaced by the stark, gritty, high-definition recording of a combat helmet cam. Pay attention, cadets, Harrison whispered into the dark. This is what happens when you wake the sleeping giant. The hologram expanded to fill the center of the lecture hall, rendering the scene in flawless, terrifying, 3-dimensional clarity. The perspective was from the helmet camera of a Coalition shock trooper commander, Sterling. The environment was a nightmare. It was the interior of a massive industrial refining facility. Rusted catwalks crisscrossed over massive vats of boiling coolant. The air was thick with ash and the acrid smoke of burning synthetic polymers. The lighting was erratic, flickering violently in emergency crimson. The audio feed kicked in, and the lecture hall was instantly assaulted by a wall of deafening noise. It wasn't the clean, high-pitched pew-pew of directed energy weapons that the cadets were used to in simulations. It was a chaotic, guttural roar. Bang, 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 bang. The kinetic weapons of the humans sounded like physical explosions tearing through the air with concussive force. On the hologram, Commander Sterling and a squad of 8 heavily armored Coalition troops were pinned down behind a thick titanium bulkhead. Their sleek, silver combat armor was scorched and dented. Sterling was shouting orders over the comms, his voice tinged with an emotion none of the cadets had ever heard from a Coalition officer. Panic. Suppressing fire. We need suppressing fire on the upper gantry. Where is our orbital support? Sterling screamed over the deafening roar of human gunfire. Atmospheric interference is too dense, Commander. We are cut off, replied another trooper, crouching low. Declan leaned forward in his seat, his earlier arrogance replaced by intense focus. He analyzed the tactical overlay blinking on the edges of the footage. The coalition troops had level 4 kinetic barriers. The human weapons shouldn't be able to penetrate them. As if answering his thoughts, the footage showed a coalition trooper standing up from cover, raising a heavy plasma repeater to lay down suppressive fire. His personal energy shield flared a brilliant blue. From the darkness of the upper gantry, a rapid staccato of flashes erupted. Brat! The cadets watched in stunned disbelief. The human weapons were firing solid slugs of depleted uranium at supersonic speeds. The first 3 rounds hit the trooper's shield, causing it to flare and ripple like water. The kinetic energy was massive. The 4th round overloaded the shield generator, shorting it out with a shower of sparks. The 5th, 6th, and 7th rounds tore straight through the trooper's reinforced chest plate as if it were made of wet parchment. The trooper was thrown backward, green bioluminescent blood spraying across the camera lens. He was dead before he hit the grated floor. By the stars, Preston muttered under his breath, his hands gripping the edges of his desk. They don't use targeted strikes, Harrison's voice narrated calmly over the chaos of the footage. They use overwhelming volume of fire. They saturate an area with so much physical mass that our defensive algorithms cannot calculate the deflection vectors. On the hologram, Commander Sterling grabbed a thermal detonator, primed it, and hurled it toward the gantry. The explosion was blinding a sphere of superheated plasma that melted the steel catwalks instantly. Burning debris rained down. Target neutralized. Move up, Sterling ordered. The remaining squad members advanced cautiously, stepping over the bubbling slag of the destroyed gantry. The area seemed clear. The human gunfire had stopped. Suddenly, a heavy steel access door to their left groaned and dented outward. Then it dented again. Someone or something was hitting it from the other side with unimaginable force. "Hold positions!" Sterling yelled, aiming his plasma rifle at the door. With a final ear-splitting screech of tearing metal, the reinforced door was kicked open. Standing in the doorway was a human. The cadets collectively gasped. They had seen anatomical diagrams of humans, but seeing one in combat was entirely different. It was a male wearing bulky, mismatched body armor that looked hastily welded together. His helmet was gone. His face was covered in soot, sweat, and blood. One of his arms hung uselessly at his side, clearly broken, the armor plating crushed inward. By all coalition medical standards, the human was in critical condition. He should have been unconscious from the pain. He should have been in systemic shock. Instead, the human's eyes were wide bloodshot and locked onto Commander Sterling with a ferocity that transcended reason. "This is Sergeant Reynolds?" Harrison's voice drifted through the dark hall. "According to the post-action medical scans we managed to extract, he had 3 broken ribs, a shattered clavicle, and massive internal bleeding. Watch his response." Sterling fired his plasma rifle. A searing bolt of blue energy struck Reynolds squarely in the shoulder. The heat flash alone should have incapacitated him. The human was knocked back, a step part of his armor melting into his uniform. Reynolds didn't fall. He didn't retreat. He let out a primal, guttural scream that clipped the audio feed's microphones. He dropped his empty kinetic rifle, reached over his back with his one good arm, and pulled out a heavy, serrated piece of mining equipment, a plasma cutter retrofitted into a brutal, glowing trench axe. "He's insane," Declan whispered, his eyes wide with horror. Reynolds didn't take cover. He charged. He closed the distance to the coalition squad with terrifying speed, ignoring the plasma bolts that grazed his legs and torso. The adrenaline and cortisol in his system had completely shut off his pain receptors. He was functioning purely on wrath. He slammed into the first coalition trooper, the sheer momentum knocking the larger alien off his feet. Reynolds swung the makeshift axe, driving the glowing, superheated blade straight through the gaps in the trooper's armor. Sterling and the others scrambled backward, firing wildly quickly in the tight corridor. The human was a blur of violence, moving erratically, using the close quarters to negate their superior firepower. He took another hit to the thigh, stumbling, but used the downward momentum to sweep the legs out from under another trooper. It was utterly unrefined. It lacked any martial elegance or tactical doctrine. It was raw, brutal, intimate slaughter. The helmet cam footage shook violently as Commander Sterling was backed against the wall. The other troopers were down, writhing or dead. Reynolds turned to Sterling. The human was breathing heavily, his uniform soaked in blood, both his own and the aliens. Sterling raised his pistol, but his hand was shaking. He fired, missing completely. Reynolds lunged. The camera lurched upward as the human grabbed Sterling by the helmet, pinning him to the bulkhead. The human's face was mere inches from the lens. The cadets could see the absolute, uncompromising hatred burning in his eyes. Reynolds didn't say a word. He didn't offer terms of surrender. He just raised the heavy, blood-stained axe. The footage abruptly cut to black. The lecture hall was plunged into absolute silence. The only sound was the rapid, shallow breathing of the cadets. The arrogant smirks were gone. Declan was pale, his hands trembling slightly on his desk. Preston looked like he was going to be sick. Professor Harrison stood in the dark, the faint glow of the control console casting long shadows across his scarred face. That, Harrison said softly, breaking the deafening silence, was a lone, heavily wounded engineer. He was not special forces. He was not genetically modified. He was just a human who was angry that we bombed his home. Harrison turned the main lights back on. The sudden brightness made the cadets wince, but none of them looked away from the professor. "Now," Harrison said, locking eyes with Declan, "do you still want to petition the Admiralty to repeal the ban?" The silence in the lecture hall was thick, heavy, and absolute. The faint hum of the climate control system, previously unnoticeable, now sounded like a roaring engine. Professor Harrison leaned heavily against the console, his cybernetic leg whirring softly as it adjusted to his shifting weight. He let the horror of the footage marinate, allowing the reality of human violence to dismantle 3 years of pristine, sanitized military theory. Declan finally broke the silence. He didn't stand up this time. His voice, usually ringing with aristocratic authority, was tight and strained. "An anomaly," Declan said, though it sounded more like a question than a statement. "Professor, surely that was a statistical outlier. The adrenaline, the rage, it's biologically unsustainable. One wounded engineer getting the drop on a squad in close quarters is unfortunate, but it doesn't equate to the loss of 3 battalions. Harrison looked at Declan with a mixture of pity and exhaustion. "You still want to view this through the lens of a spreadsheet, cadet. You want to believe Sergeant Reynolds was a glitch in the Matrix." Harrison shook his head slowly. "He wasn't a glitch. He was the baseline." The professor swiped his hand across the console, and the bloody visage of the human engineer was replaced by a massive, rotating, 3-dimensional tactical map of the new Copenhagen colony. It was a sprawling network of surface refineries and deep subterranean mining shafts. "Let me introduce you to the reality of human pack dynamics." Harrison continued, his voice projecting across the tiered seating. "When Commander Sterling's squad failed to report back, the Coalition Command assumed it was a localized comms failure. They sent 2 more squads to investigate. They found Sterling's team butchered, not just killed, dismembered with industrial cutting tools." Preston, sitting next to Declan, swallowed audibly. "But sir, our tactical doctrine dictates that upon encountering overwhelming local resistance, the enemy will either fall back to fortify a central command point or surrender to avoid further casualties. And that is exactly what the Coalition Command thought," Harrison agreed. "So General Kalin, the theater commander, deployed the 2nd Mechanized Infantry, 500 heavily armed shielded troops backed by hovering artillery platforms. He ordered them to march on the central civilian hub of the colony. The objective was simple: capture the non-combatants, and the human resistance will capitulate." Harrison tapped a key. Red markers representing the coalition forces appeared on the edges of the holographic map, slowly pushing toward a cluster of blue dots in the center. "This is where the operation moved from a policing action to a bloodbath," Harrison said quietly. The human command structure on LV-426 didn't consist of military generals. The colony was overseen by a civilian forewoman named Catherine Shaw, and her head of local security, a former Earth military veteran named Thomas Wyatt. When they realized our forces were targeting the civilian sector, their entire psychological paradigm shifted. Harrison pulled up an audio file. "This is an intercepted, unencrypted radio transmission broadcast by Thomas Wyatt on all local frequencies 10 minutes before the second mechanized breached the colony limits. I want you to listen to the tone. Not the words, but the tone." Static hissed from the speakers, followed by a human voice. It wasn't shouting. It wasn't panicked. It was terrifyingly calm, carrying a cold, metallic resonance. "Coalition forces, this is Chief Wyatt. You have crossed the primary processing line. You are firing on unarmed miners, medical staff, and children. We tried to surrender the orbital docks. You didn't listen. Now we are not asking you to leave. We are telling you that you are never leaving. God have mercy on your souls because we are fresh out." "He didn't ask for reinforcements," Harrison pointed out to the frozen cadets. "He didn't plead for a ceasefire. He made a promise." "What did they do?" asked Oliver from the back row, his voice barely a whisper. "They weaponized the planet," Harrison replied. "Humans possess a trait they call spiteful ingenuity. When outgunned, they do not fight fair. They don't fight force with force. They fight force with physics." The hologram shifted, zooming in on the industrial sectors surrounding the civilian hub. "Our shields are designed to deflect directed energy and high-velocity kinetic impacts," Harrison explained. "So the humans stopped shooting at us. Instead, Wyatt and his engineers bypassed the safety regulators on the colony's central ammonia coolant systems. As the second mechanized marched through the narrow canyons of the refining district, the humans remotely detonated the pressurized pipes. A series of bright white flashes blossomed on the hologram, engulfing the red dots. "They didn't try to pierce our armor," Harrison said, his eyes darkening with a memory. "They flooded the canyon with millions of gallons of liquid ammonia. It flash froze the ambient moisture in the air. The temperature dropped to -80 degrees Celsius in 3 seconds. Our troops didn't die from gunfire. Their armor joints froze solid. Their atmospheric filters cracked. They suffocated in their own frozen lungs while trapped inside their mechanized suits, completely unable to move." A collective shudder ran through the lecture hall. The idea of being frozen alive inside one's own power armor violated every clean, sanitized concept of warfare the cadets had ever been taught. "And the ones who survived the freeze?" Declan asked, his voice losing all its previous arrogance. Harrison's lips pressed into a thin, grim line. "That is when Forewoman Shaw sent in the heavy mining rigs. They drove massive, unshielded, treaded vehicles straight into our paralyzed formation, crushing our elite soldiers under thousands of tons of raw iron tracks. It was industrial slaughter." The atmosphere in the room had shifted from a classroom lecture to a psychological autopsy. The cadets were entirely captivated, staring at the holographic map as if it were a portal to hell itself. General Kalen, Harrison continued, was enraged. He viewed the loss of the second mechanized not as a tactical defeat, but as a personal insult. It was a humiliation, a Tier 1 armada being embarrassed by dirt diggers. Against the advice of his subcommanders, he invoked Protocol Black, total pacification. Harrison changed the map's parameters. A massive swarm of red dots appeared, representing the remaining 3 battalions, over 3,000 troops supported by heavy armor and low-altitude gunships. Kalen ordered a total scorched earth advance. No prisoners, no holding territory, just a wall of plasma moving across the colony. Creston frantically ran calculations on his datapad. "Sir, a force that size moving in a concentrated wedge formation, the humans wouldn't have enough ammonia or kinetic ammunition to stop them. The mathematical probability of human survival drops to less than 0.2%. "You are correct, Cadet Preston," Harrison nodded. "Wyatt and Shaw knew that. They knew they couldn't hold the surface, so they did what humans have done since their prehistoric ancestors were hunted by apex predators. They went underground." The map tilted, revealing the vast, intricate web of subterranean mining shafts stretching miles beneath the planet's crust. The blue dots representing the humans had all vanished into the depths. "Kalen ordered his troops into the mines," Harrison said. "He wanted them exterminated." Declan shook his head. "That's a severe tactical error. Forcing a technologically superior army into a confined subterranean environment negates the advantage of our orbital artillery and air support. Yes, it does, Harrison agreed. But Kalen's pride blinded him, and the humans counted on it. The moment our troops entered the primary shafts, they realized they weren't engaging an army. They were stepping into a meat grinder. Harrison brought up a series of fragmented, heavily distorted combat logs on the screen. The humans didn't fight pitched battles. They engaged in asynchronous psychological warfare. They disabled the lighting. They used the acoustic properties of the deep mines to echo the sounds of our own dying soldiers, playing them on infinite loops through the comms channels. Harrison pointed to a specific deep level of the mine. Then there were the ghosts. Human snipers using ancient bolt-action kinetic rifles without any electronic targeting systems. Our thermal scanners couldn't track them because the humans were covering themselves in sub-zero mud to mask their heat signatures. A coalition squad would be walking down a dark tunnel, and suddenly the soldier in the back's head would simply explode. No plasma flash, no energy signature, just a supersonic piece of lead tearing through the dark, followed by absolute silence. "It drove our troops insane," Harrison said, his voice dropping into a solemn whisper. "I know this because I was there. I was a lieutenant in the Vanguard Company." The cadets gasped. Harrison had never spoken about his specific deployments before. He had always been a mythic figure, a man of abstract military history. Now the scarred, limping man standing before them was a survivor of the very nightmare they were watching. By week 4, Harrison said, his grey eyes staring through the cadets, looking at ghosts only he could see, unit cohesion had completely collapsed. Soldiers were firing blindly into the dark, draining their plasma batteries at shadows. We were rationing rations, surrounded by the rotting corpses of our comrades because the humans booby-trapped our dead. If you tried to retrieve a fallen soldier, a hidden kinetic explosive would take your legs off. "Why didn't you retreat?" Declan asked softly. "Kalen threatened to execute any officer who ordered a fall back," Harrison replied bitterly. He was convinced we had them cornered in the deepest sector, the geothermal processing core. He ordered all remaining battalions to converge on Sector 4. On the hologram, the massive swarm of red dots slowly, painfully funneled down into a massive cavern at the very bottom of the map. In the center of the cavern sat the colony's primary power source, a massive tapping bore drilled directly into the planet's mantle. "We breached the core," Harrison said. 3,000 of us, battered, terrified, but ready to finally end it. We secured the perimeter. We aimed our weapons at the blast doors of the control room, expecting a final, desperate stand. Harrison paused, letting out a long, heavy breath. But the blast doors were open. The control room was empty. Confusion rippled through the cadets. "Empty?" Preston asked. "Where were they?" "They were gone," Harrison said. Wyatt and Shaw had evacuated the surviving civilians and resistance fighters through an uncharted emergency vent that led to a secondary landing pad on the surface miles away. They had commandeered 3 of our own orbital cargo haulers. "Then why draw you all the way down there?" Declan asked, though the dawning horror on his face suggested he already knew the answer. Harrison didn't speak. He reached out and tapped a single blinking icon on the hologram. "Because," Harrison said softly, "they didn't want to defeat our army. They wanted to erase it." An audio recording began to play. It was the final transmission from Thomas Wyatt, broadcast locally to the coalition troops standing in the empty core. "General Kalen, if you are hearing this, you are standing in my house. You bombed my people. You brought war to a colony of miners. You wanted to see what humanity was capable of. Look at the primary coolant dials on the geothermal tap." There was a pause on the audio, followed by the frantic, panicked voice of a coalition technician. "Sir, the safeties are gone. The pressure, it's overriding. The mantle is breaching." Wyatt's voice returned cold as the void. "We don't surrender, Kalen. If we can't have this rock, nobody can. Welcome to hell." On the hologram, the blue icon of the geothermal tap turned blindingly white. "They didn't just overload a reactor," Harrison said over the rising crescendo of static on the recording. "They shattered the planet's crust. They vented millions of tons of superheated pressurized magma directly into the cavern. The holographic map erupted. The red dots didn't even have time to scatter. They were simply swallowed by a massive, expanding sphere of bright orange light. 3,000 elite coalition soldiers," Harrison said, his voice cutting through the silence. as the hologram faded to black. Vaporized in less than 4 seconds. I survived only because my unit was tasked with guarding the upper elevator shafts miles above the core. The shockwave threw me against a bulkhead, shattering my leg and half my ribs. Harrison turned on the main lights. The blinding glare of the artificial suns flooded the room, but it brought no warmth. The cadets sat frozen, their pristine uniforms suddenly feeling very fragile. Humanity sacrificed a multi-trillion credit mining colony, destroyed a quarter of a planet's surface, and nearly wiped out their own civilian population just to ensure that the army that attacked them was annihilated. Harrison limped back to the podium, leaning his weight onto it, staring down at Declan and the future leaders of the galaxy. "That is what the Terran Exclusion Act is for," Harrison said, his voice ringing with absolute terrifying finality. "Article 88 exists because if we ever push humanity into a corner on a galactic scale, they won't just try to beat our fleets. They will set the entire universe on fire just to watch us burn with them." The revelation hung over the lecture hall like a physical weight. The sterile, perfectly calculated worldview of the Solaria Institute had been violently dismantled in the span of 30 minutes. Declan, the proud aristocrat who had dismissed humanity as a pathetic remnant of an archaic age, was now staring at his hands, his knuckles white. "Professor," Oliver spoke up from the back, his voice cracking slightly. "The surface explosion, the destruction of the mining core, that was the end of the operation, wasn't it? The survivors who escaped on the cargo haulers fled the system." Professor Harrison let out a sound that was half sigh, half chuckle, a dry, bitter noise that offered zero comfort. "Fled, Cadet Oliver. You are still assigning coalition psychology to a Terran mindset. We flee when the tactical advantage is lost. Humans, particularly those who have just watched their home burn, do not flee. They escalate." Harrison brought the central holographic projector back to life. The view shifted from the shattered crust of LV-426 to the dark, silent vacuum of orbit above the planet. 3 massive blips hovered on the tactical grid, coalition dreadnoughts acting as the blockade. While General Kalen and his forces were being vaporized in the mantle core, the orbital blockade remained in place, Harrison explained. Commanded by Fleet Admiral Siren, the blockade consisted of 3 heavy cruisers. Their sensors detected the seismic rupture on the planet's surface. They also detected the 3 stolen coalition cargo haulers ascending through the atmosphere. Creston tapped his datapad frantically. "A standard cargo hauler has no weapon systems and minimal shielding. 3 heavy cruisers would have locked onto them before they even breached the exosphere. They would have been vaporized in seconds." "Under normal circumstances, yes," Harrison nodded. "But the humans didn't just steal the haulers. They modified them on the way up. You see, the humans have a long bloody history of relying on private military manufacturing to bypass standard military bureaucracy. Earth historical archives mention ancient corporate entities, names like Lockheed Northrop and General Dynamics. These weren't governments. They were private foundries of war. The humans of New Copenhagen utilized a localized variant of an ancient Northrop stealth polymer, a radar-absorbent resin used in their deep-core mining drills to prevent seismic feedback. Harrison zoomed in on the 3 haulers. On the sensors, they weren't solid shapes. They were flickering, ghostly silhouettes. They coated the haulers in the resin. It didn't make them invisible, but it scattered our targeting lasers just enough to prevent an automated lock-on. Admiral Siran had to order manual targeting, and manual targeting requires time. Time that the humans used. "Used for what?" Declan asked, leaning forward, utterly engrossed. "To execute a maneuver so recklessly suicidal that Siren's tactical subroutines dismissed it as an error," Harrison said. On the hologram, instead of turning away to jump into hyperspace, the 3 cargo haulers angled their thrusters directly at the flagship of the blockade, the Aegis Prime. They didn't slow down. They accelerated, pushing their sublight engines far beyond their safety limits. "They rammed them," Declan gasped. "With unarmed cargo ships?" "Not quite," Harrison said, his eyes narrowing. 2 of the haulers peeled away at the last millisecond, acting as chaff to draw the cruiser's point defense cannons. The 3rd hauler, piloted by Thomas Wyatt himself, didn't ram the hull. He aimed for the flagship's main launch bay. The lecture hall watched as the digital representation of the third hauler slammed into the massive energy shield of the launch bay doors. The sheer kinetic force of the impact shattered the hauler's forward section, but the momentum carried it through. The hauler was destroyed instantly, Harrison said, but Wyatt and a strike team of 20 surviving human security officers weren't in the cockpit. They were in the reinforced cargo hold locked inside a heavily shielded mining pod. When the hauler breached the bay, the pod was jettisoned into the interior of the Aegis Prime. The holographic display switched to the internal security feeds of the dreadnought. It was a massacre. The Coalition naval personnel were technicians and officers, not shock troops. They were entirely unprepared for the sheer, unadulterated violence that erupted from the mining pod. The humans poured out in zero gravity, the bay's artificial gravity having failed during the breach. They were tethered to the bulkheads using magnetic grapples swinging through the air like ancient vengeful primates. They didn't use plasma rifles. They used compact drum-fed kinetic shotguns tearing through the pristine corridors of the flagship. They breached the dreadnought, Preston whispered, terrified. A 20-man boarding party against a crew of 5,000. They didn't want to conquer the ship, Harrison corrected him. They wanted the hyperdrive core, and they wanted the ship's navigation logs. You see, LV-426 was an isolated colony. The humans there didn't know the coordinates of the Coalition homeworlds. Wyatt wanted those coordinates. The footage showed Wyatt, his armor blackened, his face obscured by a heavily dented void helmet, blasting his way into the main server room. He ripped a massive data drive from the console, taking a plasma bolt to his side in the process. He barely flinched, returning fire with a one-handed kinetic pistol that blew the defensive turret off its mount. They secured the data. They overloaded the dreadnought's reactor core to cover their escape, boarded a stolen Coalition stealth shuttle, and launched themselves into the debris field of the cargo haulers, disappearing from our scanners entirely, Harrison concluded, turning the footage off. They took our navigation logs. Declan realized the blood draining completely from his face. They know where our core worlds are. Harrison nodded slowly. Yes, Cadet. Thomas Wyatt took the locations of our homeworlds back to Earth, and he took the footage of the second mechanized marching on his civilian population. He showed the leaders of humanity exactly what the Galactic Coalition is capable of. The implications of Harrison's words hung in the air, a guillotine suspended by a thread over the collective pride of the room. The cadets were no longer looking at the professor with skepticism or arrogance. They were looking at him with the wide, terrified eyes of prey that had just realized the predator was already inside the cage. Preston, his mind desperately clinging to the logic of military superiority, raised a trembling hand. But Professor, even with our navigation logs, Earth is just one planet. We have an armada of 10,000 capital ships. If they knew our locations and we knew theirs, why didn't the High Council just order a preemptive strike? We could have jumped a Vanguard fleet into the Sol system and glassed Earth from orbit before they even built a proper Starfleet. A logical question, Harrison conceded, limping away from the console and pacing the floor. And it is exactly the question the High Council asked. In fact, 3 years after the disaster at LV-426, they authorized a covert expeditionary force. 500 of our most advanced stealth dreadnoughts. Their mission: enter the Sol system, establish a perimeter, and execute a total planetary bombardment of Earth. What happened? Declan asked, his voice barely audible. They never made it past the Oort cloud, Harrison said softly. He didn't use the hologram this time. He wanted the cadets to use their own imaginations to feel the terror of the unseen. The Sol system is surrounded by a massive spherical shell of icy debris and comets, Harrison explained. Our fleet transitioned out of hyperspace on the very edge of this cloud, preparing to initiate their stealth drives for the approach to Earth. But the moment they dropped into real space, they triggered an automated network, a massive system-wide array of deep space sensors. Harrison stopped pacing and looked directly at Preston. The humans didn't build energy shields around their planet. They knew they couldn't out-engineer us in defensive energy projection, so they relied on their history. In their mid-20th century, human nations developed atomic weapons capable of wiping out their entire civilization. To prevent either side from firing, they developed a doctrine called mutually assured destruction. If one side fired, automated systems ensured the other side fired back, guaranteeing the death of both. Harrison's cybernetic leg whirred as he leaned forward. Humanity adapted this doctrine on a galactic scale. They call it the DARPA line, named after another ancient, secretive Terran military research agency. They didn't build a fleet to fight ours. They took thousands of metallic asteroids in the Oort cloud. They hollowed them out. Inside each one, they installed massive, archaic, highly unstable hyperspace engines and primitive navigation computers. Declan's eyes widened as the sheer, horrific scale of the trap became clear. Relativistic kill vehicles. Exactly, Harrison confirmed. The ultimate kinetic weapons. Millions of tons of solid iron and ice equipped with just enough engine power to jump into slipspace. The DARPA line is a dead man's switch. It is hardwired into the seismic and atmospheric sensors of Earth itself. Harrison raised a hand, ticking off the terrifying variables on his fingers. If a coalition fleet enters the Sol system with weapons hot the system arms, if Earth's atmosphere is breached by orbital bombardment, or if the planet's core registers a catastrophic thermal spike, the switch trips. The lecture hall was dead silent. If that switch trips, Harrison said, his voice dropping to a grave apocalyptic register, 10,000 iron asteroids will simultaneously jump into hyperspace. They are pre-programmed with the coordinates Thomas Wyatt stole from the Aegis Prime. They are aimed at Solaria. They are aimed at Kryn. They are aimed at every major coalition homeworld population center and shipyard in the galaxy. They wouldn't, Oliver stammered, shaking his head in denial. That's not war. That's galactic suicide. They would be destroying themselves along with us. It's completely irrational. It is the Oppenheimer Protocol. Harrison barked the sudden volume of his voice, making the cadets jump. Named after the human scientist who gave them the power to destroy their own world. He famously quoted their ancient texts, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." You call it irrational. They call it the ultimate deterrent. Harrison walked slowly up the central aisle of the lecture hall, his boots echoing heavily on the floor grates. He looked at the faces of the future admirals, pale, trembling, their arrogance stripped away completely. The human fleet commander who established the DARPA line fleet, Admiral Kincaid, sent a single, unencrypted, system-wide broadcast to our expeditionary force. When they triggered the outer sensors, Harrison said. He didn't fire a shot. He just transmitted a message. Harrison stopped right next to Declan's desk. He leaned down, his scarred face inches from the young aristocrat's pristine features. Kincaid said, "We know you are there. We know what you want to do. If you burn our home, we will ensure that the sky above your homeworlds rains iron and fire until there is nothing left but ash. Go back to your council and tell them to leave us the hell alone." Harrison stood up, smoothing his uniform. Our expeditionary force turned around. They returned to the capital. The next week, the High Council drafted the Terran Exclusion Act, Article 88. He walked back to the front of the room, looking out at the stunned silence. The ban is not a joke, cadets. It is not a political stunt. It is the only thing keeping the Galactic Coalition from being erased from the cosmos by a species that would rather pull the universe down on top of itself than submit to our authority. The terrifying reality of the DARPA line settled over the lecture hall like a suffocating blanket. The cadets of the Solaria Institute, bred for conquest and raised on the infallible logic of superior firepower, were completely paralyzed by the concept of mutually assured destruction. The idea that a species would willingly hold a blade to their own throat just to ensure their enemy bled with them defied every tactical algorithm they had ever studied. Cadet Arthur, a usually stoic strategist from the inner colonies, raised a shaky hand. "Professor Harrison, if the situation is a stalemate, if they have their dead man switch and we have our armadas, why are we still studying them? If Article 88 means we never cross into the Sol system, shouldn't they just be a closed chapter in our history books, a dangerous anomaly we simply avoid?" Harrison let out a raspy, humorless chuckle. It was a sound that scraped against the quiet of the room. He leaned heavily on his podium, his cybernetic leg letting out a high-pitched whine as it adjusted to his shifting weight. "You think the humans just built their fortress and went to sleep, Cadet Arthur?" Harrison asked, his slate-gray eyes scanning the rows of humbled students. "You think a species born on a death world, a species that weaponized their own planet's mantle out of spite, would simply trust a line drawn on a stellar map Harrison tapped the control console. The holographic projector hummed back to life, but it didn't show a tactical battlefield or a planetary system. Instead, it projected a dizzying, complex web of data nodes, financial streams, and logistical supply chains. It was a map of the Galactic Coalition's infrastructure. The DARPA line was only Phase 1, Harrison explained, his voice taking on a grim lecturing tone. Phase 1 was survival. Phase 2 is the reason the High Council is truly terrified. When Thomas Wyatt stole the navigation logs from the Aegis Prime, he didn't just steal coordinates. He stole our communication protocols. He stole our encryption keys. He stole the digital blueprint of our entire civilization. Declan, still pale but trying to engage his analytical mind, frowned. But our encryption changes daily. An archaic computing system from Earth couldn't possibly keep up with quantum-shifting algorithms. You are correct, Declan, Harrison nodded. Their hardware couldn't, so they didn't try to brute force our systems. They used what humans excel at: deception, infiltration, and asynchronous warfare. They didn't attack our military networks. They attacked our civilian infrastructure. Harrison zoomed in on a cluster of nodes glowing a sickly yellow. 4 years ago, the Central Banking Guild on the agricultural world of Demeter experienced a glitch. Trillions of credits simply evaporated from their ledgers. 2 weeks later, the automated orbital agricultural harvesters on the planet stopped recognizing grain and started classifying it as toxic weeds. They burned a planetary harvest in 3 days. A cyber attack? Preston asked, his datapad forgotten on his desk. But the Coalition Security Bureau blamed that on a rogue AI construct. A convenient lie, Harrison retorted. The truth is, humanity has established a dedicated digital warfare division. We intercepted a fragment of their code before it self-deleted. It was signed by a human named Director William Collins. They don't just sit behind their DARPA line. They are inside our networks right now. They monitor our supply chains. They know when we suffer a famine, when we have a political uprising, and when our fleet deployments shift. Harrison walked slowly down the aisle, his boots and cybernetic limb thudding in a rhythmic, ominous cadence. They haven't fired a single shot since the First Contact War, but they don't have to. Whenever a coalition faction begins to amass resources, whenever a politician runs on a platform of military expansion mysteriously, their supply ships suffer hyperdrive failures, their personal finances are drained, their political scandals are suddenly broadcast on every public holoscreen. They are holding us hostage, Arthur whispered, horrified. Not just with weapons, but with our own society. They are managing us, Harrison corrected him sharply. They treat the Galactic Coalition like a dangerous, unpredictable animal. They keep us contained in our own cage, making sure we never get too unified, too strong, or too ambitious. Harrison stopped at the end of the aisle and slowly, deliberately rolled up the left leg of his uniform trousers. The cadets gasped. They had known the professor had a prosthetic, but they had assumed it was standard Coalition medical technology, sleek, elegant, and perfectly integrated. The leg Harrison revealed was none of those things. It was a brutal, utilitarian piece of engineering. It was made of dull brushed steel and exposed hydraulics. It was heavy, lacking any aesthetic grace, clearly designed purely for function and durability. Stamped onto the side of the metal calf in blocky, archaic lettering was a single word: Aegis Tech, made in Earth. My leg wasn't crushed in the mantle explosion on LV-426, Harrison said softly, the silence in the room hanging on his every word. I was caught in the blast radius, yes. My leg was severed, and I was bleeding to death in the dark. My own unit abandoned me in the retreat. Harrison looked down at the mechanical limb. I was found by human scavengers looking for salvage after the battle. By all Coalition military doctrine, they should have executed me. I was the enemy. I had marched on their home, but they didn't. He looked back up, his eyes locking onto Declan's. They took me to their underground medical triage. A human trauma surgeon named Dr. Benjamin Carter spent 12 hours operating on me. He saved my life. He gave me this leg. And when I was stable, Thomas Wyatt himself walked into my recovery room. The cadets leaned in, completely enraptured by the confession of their legendary instructor. Wyatt told me that humanity doesn't exterminate for sport. Harrison recalled his voice tight with emotion. He said they only kill when they have no other choice. He put me on a medical shuttle, gave me the coordinates of the nearest Coalition outpost, and told me to go home. He told me to be the messenger. Harrison rolled his trouser leg back down. I am not here to teach you history, cadets. I am the messenger. I am the physical proof that humanity is capable of terrifying violence, but also of profound, calculated mercy. And that combination makes them the most dangerous species in the known universe. Harrison limped back to the front of the lecture hall, the heavy thud of his human-made leg echoing like a ticking clock. The atmosphere in the room had fundamentally changed. The arrogance of the Solaria Institute's finest had been completely sterilized, replaced by a profound, terrifying respect for the isolated species from the Class 9 death world. This brings us to the present, Harrison said, his tone shifting from reflective to urgently commanding. You are not here because Article 88 is a stagnant law. You are here because the High Council is getting desperate. Declan frowned, his tactical mind finally piercing through the shock. Desperate? Why, we have a galaxy full of resources. Because the coalition is built on expansion, Harrison explained, bringing up a new map on the hologram. It showed the borders of coalition space glowing blue, pressing hard against a vast, dark, unmapped region of the Orion Arm. The Sol system sat squarely in the middle of that dark expanse. We have exhausted the readily available hyperlanes in our current sectors. Our population is swelling. The agricultural blight, some natural, some perhaps engineered by Director Collins and his ghosts, are taking their toll. There is a faction within the Admiralty led by younger, arrogant commanders who did not fight in the First Contact War, who believe the DARPA line is a bluff. They believe humanity's cyber warfare is just smoke and mirrors from a species too cowardly to fight a real war. Harrison leaned over the console, staring directly at the cadets. In 6 months, you will graduate. You will be given commissions on Aegis-class dreadnoughts, and within a year that Admiralty faction is going to petition the High Council to send a diplomatic fleet into the Sol system to demand territorial concessions. They will disguise it as a peacekeeping mission, but it will trigger the Oppenheimer Protocol, Preston said, panic creeping into his voice. It will kill us all. Exactly, Harrison said grimly. The old guard, my generation, is dying out. We are being replaced by politicians who look at the casualty reports of LV 426 and think we can do better next time. They won't listen to me. I am considered a traumatized relic, but they will listen to you. Harrison pointed a scarred finger at Declan. They will listen to the aristocratic scions of the Solaria Institute. They will listen to the tactical prodigies. When the order comes down to cross the neutral zone, it will be on your shoulders to look your fleet admirals in the eye and tell them no. It will be your duty to commit mutiny if necessary to save our civilization from its own hubris. Declan swallowed hard, the immense weight of the responsibility settling onto his shoulders. He looked at the holographic map at the tiny dark void where Earth sat silently watching the galaxy. Professor, how long can we keep this up? We can't stay deadlocked forever. Eventually, someone is going to make a mistake. Before Harrison could answer, a piercing, high-pitched klaxon shattered the silence of the lecture hall. The emergency lighting flared crimson. The holographic projector at the front of the room violently glitched, the tactical map of the coalition borders flashing red. Cadet Oliver jumped out of his seat. Is this a drill environmental breach? Sit down. Harrison barked, his eyes glued to the console. His hands flew across the controls, bypassing the Academy's security lockouts to access the planetary defense grid's live feed. This isn't a drill. The hologram resolved into a live real-time feed of the space directly above the Solaria capital world. The Solaria planetary defense fleet, hundreds of heavy cruisers and orbital platforms were swarming like angry insects. Right in the center of the defensive formation, casually holding geostationary orbit, was a ship. It wasn't a coalition vessel. It lacked the sleek aerodynamic curves and glowing energy nacelles of their technology. It was an absolute behemoth, a brutalist slab of dark gray armor, plating exposed sensor arrays and massive blocky kinetic weapon turrets. It looked less like a spaceship and more like a flying, heavily armed fortress. Painted on the broadside of the vessel in massive white lettering that was clearly visible to the coalition sensors was the name UNS Catherine Shaw. The lecture hall erupted into chaos. How did they get here? Declan shouted over the klaxons. They bypassed the outer system sensors. They bypassed the orbital grid. That's impossible. Nothing is impossible for them anymore, Harrison whispered, a mixture of terror and awe washing over his scarred face. They didn't trigger the sensors because they didn't use hyperdrive. They must have developed localized slip space folding. They just walked through our front door. A notification blinked rapidly on Harrison's console. Incoming transmission, source unidentified vessel, encryption, none, broadcast, open channel, all frequencies. Listen to this, Harrison commanded, slamming his fist onto the audio broadcast button. The klaxons in the room muted automatically as the transmission connected. The audio was crystal clear, lacking any of the static from the old LV-426 recordings. A human voice filled the Solaria Institute, calm, authoritative, and utterly devoid of fear. Galactic Coalition High Council, this is Fleet Admiral Benjamin Carter of the Terran Alliance. We have noticed your recent border buildup near the Orion neutral zone. We assumed you might be experiencing some navigation errors, so we decided to bring our flagship to your capital to personally hand-deliver the updated maps. There was a brief pause on the transmission, and the cadets could almost hear the wry, dangerous smile in the human's voice. We are done hiding behind our line. The quarantine is officially over. We are coming down to the surface to talk. Please ensure the coffee is hot. Carter out. The transmission cut. The massive human dreadnought hung in the sky, a silent, indomitable titan, surrounded by a panicked coalition fleet that dared not fire a single shot. Harrison slowly powered down the classroom console. He looked at his students. The sheer, overwhelming reality of the universe had finally caught up to them. Class dismissed, Harrison said softly. Welcome to the new era. The Galactic Coalition thought they could quarantine humanity, locking away the monsters of the universe behind a bureaucratic ban. But you can't cage a storm forever. Earth didn't just survive the Terran Exclusion Act. They used the time to evolve, adapt, and silently infiltrate the very empire that sought to erase them. Now the sleeping giant hasn't just woken up, it has kicked down the front door of the galaxy, ready to rewrite the rules of the cosmos on its own terms. And that, my friends, is exactly why you never poke a sleeping bear, especially one from a Class 9 death world like Earth. If you enjoyed this dive into the dark, tactical, and incredibly spiteful side of HFY Sci-Fi, do me a huge favor, smash that like button, share this story with your fellow sci-fi lovers, and subscribe to the channel for more epic tales from the stars. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an upload. Until next time, keep your eyes on the skies,